Imagine a master chess player who has spent months manipulating the board, thinking they've cornered their opponent. Every move has been calculated to extract compliance, doubt, and emotional currency. The player smiles, confident in their total control. But then, the opponent doesn't just make a countermove. They look directly into the player's eyes, blink slowly, and walk away from the table entirely, taking the board, the pieces, and the very air in the room with them. In the theater of human behavior, we are taught to fear the apex predator, the narcissist. We study their tactics, the gaslighting, the weaponized empathy, the calculated devaluation. We view them as the ultimate threat to psychological stability. But we have miscalculated. There is a far more dangerous entity in the behavioral matrix, one that doesn't require a mask, an audience, or a constant stream of validation to survive. It is the fed-up empath. When a highly perceptive, emotionally attuned individual finally hits their absolute limit, something catastrophic happens within their psychological architecture. The operational software changes overnight. The person who once absorbed your stress, anticipated your needs, and gave you endless chances suddenly activates a system of total cognitive clarity. They stop feeling for you and start reading you. If you stay with me for the next few minutes, I'm going to deconstruct the exact mechanics of this psychological inversion. You will discover why the narcissist, for all their manipulation, is structurally fragile, and why a push-to-the-brink empath becomes their ultimate structural failure. We will map out the hidden metrics of human behavior that explain how the gentlest person in the room can instantly become the most dangerous psychological force a manipulator will ever encounter. You will learn the signs of this lethal behavioral shift, why the narcissist's playbook completely fails against it, and the exact moment an empath's compliance transforms into a calculated, immovable boundary. If you have ever been manipulated, or if you are trying to understand the hidden power dynamics of human profiling, you cannot afford to miss how this script flips. Every human being operates on a behavioral baseline, a set of predictable patterns, microexpressions, and psychological loops that dictate how they respond to stress, affection, and conflict. The narcissist's baseline is built on an insatiable need for external regulation. They are, by definition, a closed psychological loop that requires your emotional energy to sustain its structure. They profile you from day one. They look for your vulnerabilities, your need to please, your depth of feeling, and they use those metrics to build an architecture of compliance. For a long time, it works. The empath complies. They absorb the toxicity, acting as an emotional shock absorber. But compliance is not permanent. It is a finite resource. When an empath becomes truly fed up, a profound structural shift occurs. In behavioral analysis, the most dangerous person is never the one screaming, projecting, or demanding attention. The most dangerous person is the one who has completely mastered their internal state and no longer requires anything from you. First, because of the sheer volume of data they possess. For months, or even years, that empath has been hyper-attuned to the narcissist's behavior. They didn't just feel the manipulation, they mapped it. They know the narcissist's micro-expressions, the vocal shifts when they lie, the exact pacing of their gaslighting cycles, and the deep-seated insecurities driving their grandiosity. When the empath's emotional switch flips to off, all that accumulated data is instantly transferred from the heart to the intellect. The empath becomes a walking, talking intelligence agency with a complete psychological dossier on the narcissist. They know exactly where the structural pillars of the narcissist's ego are, and they know precisely which one to pull. Second, a fed-up empath develops absolute immunity to the playbook. A narcissist relies on predictability. If they pull lever A, they expect reaction B, guilt, tears, or a desperate plea for forgiveness. But when the empath is done, lever A produces absolutely nothing, a dead, unblinking silence. In behavior mechanics, nothing destabilizes a manipulator faster than a broken cause and effect loop. When the narcissist tries to hoover or gaslight, and meets a stone-cold analytical baseline, their entire reality fractures. They realize their illusion of control was entirely dependent on the empath's permission, and that permission has been permanently revoked. The narcissist operates through noise, chaos, and projection. The fed-up empath operates through absolute surgical detachment. They don't seek revenge, they seek erasure. They don't argue, they observe. When they look at the narcissist, they no longer see a partner, a loved one, or even an adversary. They see a transparent set of behavioral flaws. The narcissist is a parasite that has lost its host, but the host has just realized they never needed the parasite to breathe. That is not just a breakup, that is a total collapse of the narcissist's ecosystem. Never mistake patience for blindness, and never mistake compliance for weakness. When the gentlest soul in the room decides they have had enough, they don't just leave the game. They rewrite the rules, close the book, and walk away with the power the narcissist spent a lifetime trying to steal. The concept of the baseline shift is the single most critical variable when analyzing the catastrophic breakdown of the narcissist-empath dynamic. Every individual possesses a behavioral baseline, a complex tapestry of vocal inflections, micro-expressions, pacing, response latencies, and emotional thresholds that remain relatively consistent under normal conditions. In a typical relationship, a manipulator spends a tremendous amount of cognitive energy establishing a predictive model of their target's baseline. They learn precisely how much pressure is required to elicit a response of guilt, how deep a slight must go to trigger anxiety, and exactly which emotional levers to pull to ensure compliance. The narcissist relies entirely on this predictability. It is the oxygen that feeds their sense of omnipotence. They operate under the absolute certainty that the empath's baseline is fundamentally anchored in a recursive loop of forgiveness, hypertolerance, and emotional absorption. However, what the manipulator fails to realize is that an empath's capacity for endurance is not an infinite elasticity, but a high-tension system under cumulative structural stress. When that snapping point is finally reached, it does not result in a temporary spike in emotional reactivity or a loud, chaotic outburst, both of which the narcissist knows how to manage and exploit. Instead, it triggers a catastrophic, irreversible recalibration of the empath's entire psychological architecture. This is a profound baseline shift. Overnight, the emotional shock absorber hardens into a diamond-grade analytical surface. The behavioral metrics that once defined the empath, the immediate warmth, the submissive posture, the scanning for approval, the rapid verbal pacing meant to soothe conflict, are completely erased. In their place emerges a flat, unreadable, and utterly unshakable baseline, characterized by prolonged eye contact without emotional leakage, a drop in vocal pitch, a slowing of speech cadence, and a total absence of defensive posturing. This sudden transformation completely shatters the narcissist's predictive model. In behavioral science, nothing induces psychological vertigo faster than a complete loss of environmental predictability. The narcissist suddenly finds themselves operating in a room where the laws of gravity have changed. They pull the familiar levers of gaslighting, expecting the baseline response of defense or tears. But instead, they meet a chillingly still, unblinking observation. The narcissist tries to escalate using weapons of rage or feigned vulnerability, but the empath's new baseline refuses to absorb the projection. It is a closed system, entirely self-contained. This baseline shift is so uniquely dangerous because it signals to the narcissist's subconscious that the emotional supply line has not just been restricted, but entirely dismantled at the root. The predictability upon which the narcissist's ego preservation depends is gone, replaced by an asymmetric behavioral profile that they can neither read nor control, turning their own weaponized loops into useless, empty gestures against an immovable psychological wall. The data advantage possessed by an empath is not a vague, mystical intuition. It is a highly sophisticated, hyper-vigilant data-gathering apparatus operating at a subconscious level from the very inception of the relationship. Empaths are biological recording devices. Due to an intensely active mirror neuron system and a heightened sensitivity to environmental and interpersonal microclues, they spend months, sometimes years, involuntarily harvesting immense amounts of behavioral data. While the narcissist believes they are successfully hiding behind a carefully curated mask, the empath's internal tracking system is quietly cataloging every subtle anomaly. They register the split-second delay between the narcissist's spoken words of affection and the coldness in their eyes. They note the micro-expressions of contempt that flash across the manipulator's face when someone else receives praise. They record the vocal pitch shifts that occur during a lie, the changes in respiratory pacing when a boundary is threatened, and the specific behavioral loops used during the cycles of love bombing, devaluation, and discard. For a long period, this massive intelligence dossier remains completely dormant or suppressed because the empath's overarching objective is harmony, restoration, and emotional rescue. They use their understanding of the narcissist's deep-seated psychological wounds to justify the abuse, essentially using their data to protect the person hurting them. However, the moment the empath hits their breaking point and becomes entirely fed up, a profound cognitive inversion takes place. The operational objective shifts instantly from preservation to cold clinical analysis. The emotional dampener is removed, and that massive, latent reservoir of behavioral data is instantly weaponized into a high-definition psychological profiling tool. The empath no longer feels for the narcissist. They look through them with surgical clarity. The narcissist suddenly finds themselves completely exposed, standing naked before an interlocutor who possesses a flawless map of their internal architecture. When the narcissist attempts to initiate a standard gaslighting sequence, the fed-up empath doesn't engage with the narrative content. Instead, they call out the exact behavioral mechanic being deployed. They might calmly observe the rapid blink rate, the defensive posture, or the specific phraseology the narcissist uses when backing into a corner. They point directly to the structural flaws in the manipulator's reality, dismantling the illusion not with emotional outrage, but with undeniable empirical evidence gathered from the narcissist's own past behavior. This sudden inversion of the information asymmetry is utterly terrifying to a manipulator. The narcissist relies on being the psychological apex predator who controls the narrative and holds the cards. To realize that the person they viewed as a compliant source of supply has actually been maintaining a flawless, subconscious record of their deepest insecurities, manipulative patterns, and fraudulent personas is a devastating blow. The fed-up empath uses this data advantage to strip the narcissist of their mystique, rendering their weaponized loops completely transparent, entirely predictable, and utterly useless within the interaction. The de-escalation of the ego represents the ultimate structural failure for the narcissist's manipulative framework because it attacks the very currency upon which the entire toxic dynamic is traded. A narcissist is bound by rigid, unchanging laws of ego preservation and external validation. Every tactical maneuver they deploy, whether it is the grandiosity of a love-bombing phase or the calculated cruelty of a discard, is designed to force the target to engage on the battlefield of the ego. They require you to care about their opinion, to fear their rejection, and to defend your own character against their distorted accusations. This constant back and forth keeps the victim trapped in an anxious state of psychological compliance, perpetually trying to fix a broken narrative. However, when an empath undergoes the profound transformation of becoming completely pushed to the brink, they experience an abrupt and total ego death regarding the relationship itself. The desire to be understood, the need to prove their innocence, and the longing for closure or validation from the narcissist are entirely extinguished. This shift is not a conscious decision to act tough. It is a fundamental chemical change in their psychological commitment to the connection. The empath simply stops investing any value in the narcissist's perception of reality. When this occurs, the empath achieves an absolute, terrifying immunity to the traditional weapons of emotional warfare. Gaslighting relies entirely on the victim's desperate desire to remain aligned with the manipulator and to protect the shared reality of the relationship. When the empath no longer cares about the relationship or the narcissist's view of them, gaslighting ceases to function. The narcissist can construct the most elaborate, distorted narrative to make the empath look like the villain, and the fed-up empath will simply observe the performance with detached curiosity, offering no defense, no anger, and no tears. Hoovering tactics. The desperate attempts by the narcissist to pull the victim back into the loop using feigned crises, false apologies, or nostalgia rely on the empath's residual emotional attachment and guilt. But an empath operating from a position of ego de-escalation is completely dead to these emotional triggers. The guilt trips encounter a vacuum. The emotional hooks find no purchase because the empath's ego is no longer extended toward the narcissist to be grabbed. This total collapse of emotional stakes completely disarms the manipulator. In behavioral analysis, you cannot control an asset that wants nothing from you, fears nothing from you, and places zero value on your approval. The narcissist suddenly finds themselves shouting into an empty canyon, realizing that all their grand narratives, projection techniques, and manufactured dramas require a reactive ego on the other side to have any power. By stepping completely outside the ego matrix, the fed-up empath renders the narcissist's entire psychological arsenal completely obsolete. The quiet execution is the tactical turning point where the power dynamic permanently flips, characterized by a transition from chaotic emotional noise to an absolute chilling containment of energy. Narcissists operate in a theater of high drama, projection, and loud psychological displacement. When they attack, devalue, or discard a target, it is an incredibly noisy process filled with verbal assaults, smear campaigns, and highly performative displays of superiority. This theater serves a dual purpose. It distracts from the narcissist's internal emptiness and forces the victim into a chaotic, defensive state of panic. The narcissist expects a matching level of noise from the empath: crying, screaming, begging, or desperate texts detailing their pain. This explosive emotional reactivity confirms to the narcissist that they still possess complete dominion over the empath's internal state. However, when an empath truly detaches, they completely abandon this theatrical paradigm. They do not engage in a loud, dramatic confrontation, nor do they offer a cinematic speech about how much they have been hurt. Instead, they execute a systemic, silent, and lethal emotional withdrawal. In behavioral analysis, true danger rarely announces itself with a roar. It presents as a sudden, absolute drop in ambient noise. The fed-up empath stops explaining themselves, stops correcting the narcissist's lies, and stops offering any behavioral feedback whatsoever. This quiet execution manifests physically as a complete shutdown of nonverbal leaks. There are no heavy sighs, no frustrated micro-expressions, no defensive arm crossing, and no lingering glances of resentment. The empath's posture becomes neutral, relaxed, and entirely unavailable. When spoken to, their responses are stripped of all emotional cadence, defaulting to cold, monosyllabic confirmations, or a level of unbothered silence that mirrors an empty room. This sudden starvation of emotional supply is catastrophic for the narcissist's psychological ecosystem. A manipulator can skillfully navigate anger, sadness, or hatred because all those emotions still represent a form of energetic investment. They are all currencies that acknowledge the narcissist's significance. What a narcissist cannot survive is a total vacuum. The quiet execution cuts the emotional supply lines completely and cleanly, leaving no threads for the narcissist to pull on. It is an absolute severing of the behavioral feedback loop. The narcissist is left desperately throwing emotional matchsticks into a dark abyss, waiting for an explosion that never comes. By refusing to provide a reflection, a counterargument, or even a flicker of irritation, the fed-up empath forces the narcissist to confront the terrifying silence of their own internal space, making this quiet, bloodless detachment the most devastatingly potent execution of a boundary possible in human relationships. The concept of the ultimate mirror marks the final, devastating phase of the psychological inversion between the narcissist and the fed-up empath. Throughout the entire history of the relationship, the narcissist has used the empath as a dumping ground for their own unacknowledged psychological shadow. Unable to process feelings of deep-seated inadequacy, shame, and fragmented identity, the narcissist relies on projection as a survival mechanism. They actively externalize their inner chaos, accusing the empath of the very manipulations, insecurities, and cruelties that they themselves are committing. For a long time, the highly absorbent nature of the empath acts as a sponge for this toxic energy. They internalize the blame, agonizing over how to fix themselves to stabilize the relationship. But when the empath becomes entirely fed up, their psychological surface undergoes a profound chemical alteration, shifting from a porous, absorbent sponge to an unblemished, hyper-reflective sheet of obsidian glass. They stop absorbing the projection, and instead, they simply reflect it back with absolute, passive neutrality. In behavioral profiling, this is the exact moment the manipulator's entire defense system collapses. When the narcissist launches a standard smear campaign, an accusation, or a wave of projection, it no longer penetrates the empath's emotional matrix. It hits this newly formed psychological mirror and bounces directly back to its point of origin. The fed-up empath does not argue, deflect, or absorb. They sit in stillness, holding up the mirror by simply existing in absolute clarity. If the narcissist rages, saying the empath is cold and heartless, the empath's unbothered, steady gaze forces the narcissist to realize they are merely describing their own internal landscape. The narcissist is suddenly trapped in an inescapable psychological feedback loop, forced to look directly at the vacuum of their own identity without the buffer of the empath's emotional distress to distract them. This creates an intense state of narcissistic mortification. For decades, the narcissist has run away from their own internal emptiness by generating external chaos, using the victim's emotional reactions to validate their own existence and superiority. Without those reactions, the external noise stops, leaving only the reflection of their own fractured psyche. The fed-up empath's refusal to absorb the projected shame means that the narcissist is forced to choke on their own poison. They are left alone in a room with their own mask, fully aware that the person across from them sees the fraudulence, the fragility, and the desperate panic beneath the bravado.